Alrighty, hello there folks. So, we are talking about Voronoi textures today. Fun, right? These are cool. But oftentimes they go largely unappreciated. For instance, this is like the only thing that people use it for along with like this shit, right? So it's like ripples and all that stuff. Very few people know actually how to use this texture in ways other than like two obvious ways. Mainly like ripples and shit. That's what people use it for. And then there's like some texturing stuff. But yeah, so we're gonna go into a couple interesting uses for this. Some are basic, some are like pretty unknown, but still pretty useful in my book. I'll try and keep it brief, that way people don't get bored. Let's get started. So we got this base Voronoi texture. Pretty fun. There's obviously stuff you can do with this that I'm not going to get into because it's kind of basic, rather obvious. I will start by quickly defining what a Voronoi texture is, and I'm going to switch to 2D for this. So what Voronoi textures are is it's mapping the distance from a pixel to the closest point. So you distribute number of points and cells on a square, or on, what am I saying? You distribute points like one. So you take a two-dimensional space, or actually sometimes 3 or 4-dimensional, whatever. You take an n-dimensional space and you subdivide it into a grid, and then in each cell of the grid you put one. Let me turn off my music. You put one point in each cell in the grid, and that point. So basically, for each pixel, you're mapping the distance to the closest point on the grid. So yeah, you will get neat effects like this, and that's why when the distance is 0, you can see these points forming, right? And then there are also edges, because at some point, this point right here is the closest point, rather than this one or any of these others, right? But that's for F1. So F1 is just closest point Voronoi. F2 is the second closest point Voronoi. So this will map the distance to the second nearest point. And you can see that if we go into color, and then add in a color ramp, because something neat happens. Look at this. There are rings. These aren't independent cells. These are each rings, which is pretty cool. Right? And you also see in position, it's a little bit more fractally, and there. When I say not fractally. But we can see these rings also form, as opposed to F1. It was like you can see. In F2, these are forming rings around the F1. So, like, pay attention to this dark one right there. And you can see, same color, ring around the dark one. Let's go back. Pretty fun. But this allows us to do some pretty interesting mathematical maneuvers here. So, one of the most fun things you can do, and this I don't actually think many people know about, is you can take a Voronoi F2, and provided these have the same scale and randomness value, you can mix it with a Voronoi F1 at a factor of 0.5. So just literally to mix it, the position, and you're going to get something like this. This is an edge Voronoi, essentially. So under normal circumstances, each cell in the Voronoi will contain 1 point. Let's duplicate this to illustrate that. So I'm going to multiply by the distance. So you see each cell contains an edge, or sorry, each cell contains a point, and precisely 1 point, not 0. Well, I actually made a node group for this. That's a bit easier. So I'm gonna disable this, and yeah. So I've just essentially, it's the same thing, except it's just there's one for distance, one for color, one for position. So I get 3 outputs. In this, you'll notice if I multiply this by the distance, there is precisely 1 edge in each cell. And we can see that a bit more if we do distance to edge. So each one of these cells contains an edge. You can see right there, and then you get tiny ones like that. It's pretty fun. Certainly worth looking, and this will change appropriately based on the scale, randomness, whatever. Let me get value so we can operate these independently. So you can see we can change the scale, we can change the randomness, and it updates appropriately. So that is really neat, but that is not inherently useful. So how do we make it inherently useful? Actually, let's add this back in. So instead of a multiply here, I'm going to do a vector math. And I'm going to subtract. Oh, pardon. And instead of this, I'm going to just get a regular F1 and plug the position. Let's actually do that. So what are we doing here? And what is the significance of this? So this is a super fun thing. This doesn't look like much at first, but these colors are actually returning the value of the direction vector from one point to the next, from the first point to the second point. So we can see if we take actually no, here, I'm trying to find a way to illustrate this, pardon. So, I guess I'll just have to sort of go through how to properly see this and how to use this. So, you'll have to convert this into a angle. So we're going to have to take a separate XYZ here. And then we're going to have to do math. Set this to arctan 2, that's for arctangent, so we can use this as a tangent vector. And then vector rotate, plug this into the angle. And then we're going to have to do this thingamajigger. We're going to have to subtract the position from this, the position output of this from the position output from the vector that we're inputting to this, and that's basically just gonna give us this. So it's like the sort of Voronoi scattering technique, and then we can plug this vector into that, and we can see the result. Let's see, I think we might get a better picture from there. You can see that. I'm actually gonna get that, and then we do a separate XYZ and then plug in a absolute node. We can see sort of what's happening here. And the fun thing is, this is where it's going to make sense what I've been doing. This will be, each of these will be a line in between two of the closest points. Now, it's not perfect, but it will be there. And I'll show you what I mean when I say it's not perfect. So if we take the distance output and we sort of mix it in slightly, we can see that each of these lines will intersect between 2 points. Some of these is pretty clean, some of these it isn't. But you can see this line, which right there goes between these two. This line goes between these two. And it's pretty fun. Yeah. You might ask, rightly so, how is this even practical? And I literally just used it in a project last night. Look at this. This is some solar flare experimentation. And you can see I can use a Voronoi to make these, and I can literally take these lines that I generated, and I can use them to as inputs for the noise. So let me show you that implementation real quick. It is really neat. So I'm gonna just kill this because we don't need that. But I can instead take texture, noise texture, turn the roughness up, and just for quality of life. So I can make these lines, and then the fun thing I can do is I can duplicate this, and instead of setting it to F1, I can set it to smooth F1, and then divide the input to the noise texture by the distance output. So I get these. Then unfortunately it will cut off a little bit, but in order to remedy that, you can use a white noise. You'll have to separate. So this, you need to keep this object output that needs to stay intact for this subtract node, but for the rest of these, we are going to take a we're going to add some white noise in to blur it out, and that's also like a good technique to use for a lot of stuff. Like white noise will blur stuff out. You can find that down here, white noise. So just plug that in there. Subtract 0.5 from each output. Use the color output here. And then add in a scale. And just add in a little bit. Oh, that might have been a little much. But yeah, and it nicely blurs it. Right? So you can see sort of how I got that done, and there's obviously some other stuff layered on top of it, like noise distortion and all that stuff. But yeah, this is by far the most advanced technique that I'm gonna display in this video. But yeah, that's that. There are other interesting things you can do with like F3 Voronoi, but we don't have that in Blender, so unfortunately we can't do that here. Devs, please add F3. But yeah, that is the most complicated technique you'll see in this video, but it's pretty fun. These next ones will be super simple. Right? These are sort of the things that everybody knows. So Voronoi. By the way, I only showed the last one because I know the smart ones of you will pick it up. So let's say we want to scatter a point or texture somewhere on the mesh, right? Or across the mesh, and we don't want it to tile. How can we do that? So the first thing that you can do is, like, let's say we have a texture, and let's just use an image texture. Let's just grab a Quixel texture because I can. Downloaded. Yeah, this one will be fun. This one will be fun. So let's say we have this texture and we have it scaled up a decent bit. So let's add a converter, vector math, and then scale. That way we can scale this up. You can see all that lovely tiling, right? It's basically a grid now. So what we can do is we can take this Voronoi texture, use the position output, and then use a converter vector math. Oh, subtract. All right, and we now get this, and now look what happens there. Now, unfortunately, this creates seams, which is an unfortunate side effect. But we can see we've eliminated the tiling a little bit. And I'm just going to add a color ramp here so that we can see the tiling a bit more clearly. All right, that just helps illustrate it a little bit more. So, number one, we can still see these repeated features a bit. Number two, how do we eliminate these seams, or at least effectively eliminate these seams? So the answer to the first one, or actually, sorry, the second one, eliminating seams, whatever. The answer to eliminating the seams is to add noise distortion here. So right here, we're going to take a vector math, add, take another subtract one, again do the -0.5 thing, and a texture, noise texture, and then object. Actually, just take this input, and then we're going to take the color input there, duplicate this, change this to scale, and then add it in there, and that will, you can change the cause like this is what the cells look like now. You can see if we don't do this, their seam is a lot more pronounced. For this one though, we probably need a little bit less. I'm going to set this to 0.5, and instead I'm going to crank the detail up a bit more and the roughness up a little bit more. We can see this, the seam starts to be a bit more natural. And we can't even tell where it is unless we look really closely, right? So seam, that is gone. Next, we still get this repeating pattern. So one thing we've done is we varied the position, right? You can undo that by doing that, although that's a bit bad, right? Next thing we can do is we can vary the rotation of it. So let's add in the vector rotate. And this angle is what we can play with. So if we want to use, so each one of these cells will generate a random color. So we can take a converter, separate XYZ, and use one of these outputs to generate the rotation that we need. So I'm going to add a math, multiply, and then since this operates in radians, even though it says angle right there, which is kind of retarded, but whatever, we need to get 2 pi radians, so 2 times pi. That will cover the entire spectrum. Put that into the angle. And boom. Without, with. Next thing we can do, we can vary the scale and we can vary the position even more. Only vary the position if you have a seamless texture, but what you can do is you can add in just add in the color, and then I'll break it up a little bit more. I'll get it focused on certain different things. It's not that that much of a deal if you've already got this. But yeah. Why is it acting up? Oh yeah, you gotta subtract this, I think. Yeah. It's like without, with, I mean, those get a little bit more variation. It's not really a huge deal. But you can then use the scale and use another one of these channels, and I like to add in a color mix RGB and then mix it with one just at some arbitrary factor, and then plug this into there. And you can see like you'll get a lot more varied scale all the way down to like 0, so you get some stuff that's super large, some stuff that's super small. But when your factor's at 1, it won't do too much. And I'm also going to add in just duplicate that here, and I'm just going to use that to 2 so that it's roughly speaking centered around 1. So some stuff's going to be scaled up, some stuff's going to be scaled down, right? Alright. Fun stuff. Make sure you use a different channel, even though probably people won't notice, because there's 3 channels in an RGB color. Yeah, most people don't have too keen of an eye. So that's scattering 101. Fun stuff. You can see there's roughly no repetition. I mean, if you look close enough, you'll see it, but that's strikingly better from what we came from, which is this. Or actually, no. Pardon. Messed that up. Which was this. Right? Just worlds better. And then you can also take more noise into the approach. So if I want to make this even more varied, I can duplicate this scale right here. And then add in I generally use Musgrave texture. Set this to multi-fractal. And just plug that vector into there. And then set the detail up pretty high, the dimension sort of low. And then, actually, sorry, change this to mix RGB. Set this to multiply. Also change the scale down quite a bit. Alright. This will add a bit more macroscopic variation. Macroscopic, yep. Right, and just do it rather lightly, right? But you can see it's rather homogeneous, and then it's a little bit more varied. So, pretty fun. And you can really mess with it. Don't go too low, though, in the dimension, or else people will notice. Right? Yeah, stuff like that. So you might want to go a little bit more. And yeah, you can do further augmentations and stuff. But yep, that's about it. Even just, by the way, even just the Musgrave texture on this stuff works a charm. It's so much better. Come on. Alright. You'll need to do a little bit more. But like, you can hide some of the tiling just by doing that. It's wonderful. But that is a sort of pain-free approach. It uses Voronoi, which Voronoi is not always the fastest. What's going on here? Voronoi is not always the fastest texture to compute, but it works rather well. And most people don't see much performance decrease in it when using it for just average stuff like texturing a terrain. But yep, that's about it. What's another non-obvious Voronoi texture trick? Pardon, you're hearing the cogs grinding in my head. So aside from the obvious ones like ripples and stuff that directly utilizes this texture, I think that's sort of all I can think of, because it gives you more like food for thought, I guess. There's a bunch of stuff you can do by just distorting the input coordinates. Like you can get bubbly textures really easily with this, which is fun. You can also make cones and stuff, because obviously you're gonna get a conical height map, right? Actually, this gives me an idea for what we can do. This will be sort of a quick-ish thing. We can make fractal Voronoi noises, which Voronoi noises always look super cool, because look at that. So how we do this is just generally fractalifying an object. It's pretty simple. Mathematically speaking, you do this all the time. You can do this with a fucking checker texture. Is we take an iterative approach to it. So what I generally do for this is I pack up a series of node groups into a node group, a master node group, and then we can control the texture from there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just control G this, and that'll give us these three inputs. So vector, scale, randomness, and then these three outputs, the color, position, distance, that sort of thing. We aren't going to need color or position, just the distance. So I'm going to call this fact, and then I'm going to kill these two. And then what I do then is I take this fact and I put that as an input. So we're going to do that. By the way, these sorts of iterative node groups, these were touched on in my atmosphere, or not, sorry, most recent planet tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in that little node, and then I'm going to add in a math node. And I'm just going to add in this. So one principle that we're following here is, since these are node groups that are going to be sort of joined end to end like that, we need to feed in outputs from this side into the inputs here. So each one of these inputs needs to have its own output. So we got the factor. Now let's go to the vector. This one is just going to be straight through because we aren't going to have any modifications to it. And then same with the, well, actually the scale is going to be a little bit different. But yeah. Randomness, that's going to be the same. So for what we're going to do with the scale we're going to be multiplying by a constant factor. So if I'm going to multiply this by 2, and then that's going to be, so this node group will multiply the scale by 2, and it's going to output a scale that is twice that of the input scale. And then let's call this Voronoi iteration. So when we plug these into each other, the scale, if it starts as 5, it's going to be 10 in this one. The randomness is going to stay at 1. But so the factor, we can see this noise is significantly more, like we can see the scale difference, right? One thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to flip this because I think we're going to get a better view from this clouds sort of perspective. So like look at that. But unfortunately, if we keep doing this, it's going to become quite unsustainable because we're just going to have a blob of white because we're adding more and more to it each time. So we need to make this an asymptotic approach. So I'm going to use the I'm going to divide the output by the scale. Sorry, I'm going to divide the output of this color ramp by the scale. That's going to essentially make it a bit more fractally. So we see the big ones have a little bit more influence than the smaller ones. Let's add a couple more iterations. Let's make 8 in total, so we can just duplicate that. And we see that's how it works, which is pretty cool. So we get this sort of fractal Voronoi thing going on here. And then you can expand this, so you can look up like actual fractal noises, so like the Musgrave texture, right? Oh, and by the way, you're gonna have to package this all up in a node group. So take the vector input, and then the factor is just, that's gonna stay at 0. That's sort of the thing that we're marching forward. Plug in an initial scale and initial randomness because that's also a parameter. And then what you can do, since we're dividing by the scale, I'm going to multiply it by the initial scale. That way, just so it will remain a constant scale at the, or constant brightness no matter the scale. And then we can also, like that's pretty fun. When we look at Voronoi, when we look at like Musgrave textures that are fractals, we see we have the scale, the detail, the dimension, and the linearity. These things are sort of easy to implement. Let me just actually let's just walk through it because we can. So linearity, or whatever it is, linearity, that's this value. This is the linearity. So we can just call this sonority. Obviously, plug this into an output there, and then just connect all these up. That basically controls how the relative scale of the noises. So this is what happens when we scale it up, right? Dimension. Dimension is sort of how much the magnitude of the noise decreases with each iteration. So that is just an augmentation on this divide node. So yeah, I think this will work. So actually, instead of the scale here, I'm just going to have this scale at 1, and then instead of that, we just multiply the vector. Or actually, let's use a scale because that's a bit faster. We use this scale vector node and plug that into the vector, and that'll serve as a substitute for that. That way we can do the dimension a bit easier. So dimension, and then this goes into there because it's another parameter. So this is basically how much we're decreasing the this is basically how much we're decreasing the magnitude of the noise, right? So a low dimension will mean that we aren't decreasing it as much, right? So it'll be a bit spikier. So let's go, where is it? Converter, math, and then we're going to add a power. This power will be our dimension. This scale will be what we're powering, right? It's pretty fun. Oh, also I forgot one thing. This Voronoi, we're gonna subtract 0.5 from it. So instead of adding much more each time, the iterations will be centered around 0, so that's not getting much brighter. So I'm going to subtract 0.5. Boom. And then because we want the first iteration to not have this effect, we can just add an 0.5 to the end result. And then this will be dimension. Let's duplicate this for dimension. Oops, forgot to connect these. Yeah, you have to connect all of these up, so pardon, it's a bit of a pain, but it's the only way. Come on. Okay. So there you go. Pretty fun. All right. So I'm going to set this at around 1. Next thing is implementing a detail scale. So for that, we need a counter, because what we want to do is we want to set a certain detail, and then after that, we're going to just cut off all the iterations. so that we aren't using them. So first of all, we need to create a counter function. So I'm just going to implement that at the bottom. I'm going to call this counter. And essentially what this is going to do is we're going to add 1 to it each time. So add 1, bring it out, and then this value is counter. So each time we're doing a sample, we're marching this one up. So counter is going to start at 0 and it's going to end at the max number of samples. So how do we make this into a detail? A detail scale? Essentially, what we do is we take this counter. Actually, we first of all need a detail attribute. So I'm going to call this detail. And this is going to remain constant, so that's going to go in there. So okay, I think we're good there. There's just a little bit of a weirdness. Yeah, this is kind of getting frustrating. Okay, so we got our counter, we got our detail. What we're gonna do is we're gonna subtract detail from counter, and then we're gonna clamp the results. Where is it? Math. Actually, sorry, it's just here. Clamp between 0 and 1, and then we're gonna multiply this this output of this divide by the clamp. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we don't want to add any more detail after we exhaust our details. So if counter has been marked, if let's say our detail is 4 and counter marches up 4 times, so we're in the fourth node group. So counter is 4. Actually, sorry, 5th node group. And our counter is 4. Right? The detail, which is 4, minus the counter, which is also 4, is 0. And that's clamped. Sorry, this actually needs to be multiply. So this will multiply by 0, which effectively nullifies that. But if we're at, let's say we're in the counter equals 3, we will be fine because counter will be 1 less than detail. So detail minus counter is 1, which since it's within this doesn't have any effect. And this will be multiplied by 1, so it'll operate like usual. If we're in the 3rd node group, so counter is 2, this will be this will return 2. This will clamp to 1, and it'll be just as usual. So fun stuff. Let's plug that in there and move it up. And fun. So we got detail. You can see how that works. Dimension. You got linearity, I don't know. Randomness, this is kind of fun to mess with. Detail. By the way, we should clamp detail at 8 and from 0 to 8. Simply because we only have 8 node groups, so adding more detail to it won't add any more detail to it. Alright, changing the detail won't add any more detail. You can add more node groups to the end of it and extend the chain and get more detail that way. But this is just fun. And yeah, you can change, if you change the dimension, like you can get this really cool cloud pattern, right? And then you can plug it into like a color ramp or so, or something, and use it in like volumes. In a principled volume, or no, sorry, volume scatter. And like it's kind of fun. Oh, what am I doing? Right. Anyway, cool stuff. This works really well for cloud textures. Or like procedural clouds, because it just looks so much fuller than noise textures. Because it's like puffy. And let me... Yeah, there we go. That's a bit more detail. Unfortunately, it's a lot slower because it's using 8 Voronois as opposed to just regular noise, and Voronois are slower. Like a regular noise texture like Musgrave would be fine with this. Alright, but unfortunately, Voronois are pesky. But, hey, it looks good. I'm not going to complain. So yeah, that's fun. It's cool experiments. Is there anything else? I'm certain there's something. Anyways, that's just a couple tools. I'm going to sign off now. Good night, folks.